takes a moment to get on YouTube. Often it's immediate. So welcome to everyone who is joining us on YouTube. Welcome to everyone who's joining us on Zoom. We're here today for our traditional Wednesday study class, as we have decided to talk a little bit about Revolutionary War Jews. We may have Herbert and Teresa Victor, who are going to see if they can come on in a little bit. They had something going on this morning to give us a little bit of information about the participation of people from this synagogue in the Revolutionary War, and we'll talk to them about that a little bit. Also, as we always know for this class, we welcome everyone to have as much input as they'd like. So we know a lot of people are very educated. So just let us know. One of the problems with this group is people are very shy about giving their opinion. So I want to bring you out of that shyness and help you adjust. So
I'll try to say something today.
Okay, Ron, it may be a requirement. So what we're going to do today is look not at just individuals who participated in the American Revolution who were Jewish, but get an overall view of the effects the revolution had on Jews, the reasons why maybe Jews participated, a little bit about Jews not only in America, but what about Jews on the other side of the ocean? And we'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, everyone is always, of course, just share whatever you'd like, because we know everybody here is very educated. So we know the Stamp Act came in 1765. And from that point, but even earlier, you saw that Jews were very supportive of this idea, maybe not of the revolution in 1765, but of more rights for people in America, already seeing themselves as part of this body, even though after Oliver Cromwell came into power in the mid-17th century, Jews began to be treated much better by the British Empire. They were even welcomed back into England. And certainly they had been treated very well in this country by the British, probably better here than most places on planet Earth at this time. So as you can see, even though we'll talk a little bit about how the majority of Jews were Whigs, there were some Tories, and there are also obviously Jews who were on the other side, not just the British, but also we'll talk about some of the Germans who fought with the British. Now we also have to remember that the revolution, although the most important probably war in the history of our country, in terms of numbers, was not a big number war akin to World War II or World War I. There were about 100 Jews or so that actually served militarily in the revolution, but there were only about 2,500 Jews in the whole country itself. And many were serving on the sidelines doing other things, like Chaim Solomon would not have been considered somebody who fought in the revolution, unlike Mordechai Sheftel, and we'll talk about them later. So the Jews were treated much better here, and already began to thrive really since the 17th century, but certainly in the 18th century. Business was doing well. The reasons they fought in the revolution was not because of anti-Semitism or fear of the way Jews were being treated, because they had been treated fairly well comparatively. It was basically they joined the revolution for the same reasons everybody else did, it seems like. This idea of more empowerment and not to be second class compared to England, and because this was their home and they wanted to fight along with their friends. One of the other things we see that is very common, is talked a lot more about in the Civil War, is the allegiance issues that came from families. That you didn't have all families, just like the Civil War, supporting one side. You had families that were Whigs and Tories. And so very possibly you could see people fighting with each other, not as much as the Civil War, but certainly families of the Gomez's, the Franks, the Hayeses, and the Harts, very prominent American families, had members on both sides. And that is I think, true for so many people. So again, we may be talking about Jews in the American Revolution, but a lot of the issues were very similar to everybody else. Now, interestingly enough, I believe Isaac Hart was a Tory who was killed by Whigs to start the revolution. He is the first person killed who was Jewish. He may have been the first person killed in the revolution itself, and he was Jewish, again, from one of these very famous families. But we also have to look at the fact that there were Jews who were not Tories, who were not Whigs, who didn't even live in America, who were part of this revolution. Who am I talking about? Have you ever heard of the Jewish Hessians? The Hessians were a group of German soldiers, mercenaries, hired by King George to fight in this war. And some of the Hessians were Jews. And so you had Jewish Hessians coming over to fight for England, even though they were German, to fight Americans. And we will see that there was some convoluted ideas here because, of course, when they came here, they met other Jews, some were Whigs and Tories, and trying to decide what to do as a Jew, should I kill another Jew? What should I do? And also the families in America, who your family may have been a Whig, but the British have taken over your city, and all of a sudden you have these Jews who are British, but mostly these Jews who are Hessian, who weren't British, they're German, fighting with the British because they're being paid, but for no other reason, and working in with these Jewish community families. Because as we know, if you're a Jew and you go to a city, you look up other Jews, and you're usually housed by Jews, and your family knows family there. Well, now they're doing that, except for they're attacking the city. So I'm a Jewish Hessian coming to New York, and I'm meeting these Jewish families that usually I would be hanging out with and staying with, but yet I'm part of the group that's taken over the city. So some of the families were supportive, some were not, but you could see this special tension. Interestingly enough, Alexander Zuntz was a Hessian, and he is credited with saving the Shereth Israel building in New York. It was going to be torn down by the British, and he convinced them to keep it up and not tear down the sanctuary. So that was almost completely due to his intervention. And so when we have these issues, you know, there's so many things going on. We also have to remember that during the war, not everybody was concerned just with the war. I mean, people were getting married, people were having kids. And so Jews who were not directly involved in the war were having, you know, their lives, even though they were being disrupted, you know, for various reasons. Now, the effects of the war were terrible in some cases and enriching in others. What do I mean? Well, the distribution of the Jewish population was affected greatly by this war. Remember, before the war, there were only 2,500 Jews. There was only 5 synagogues in America. So what we're going to see is a redistribution of wealth, a redistribution of individuals. Certain communities are going to thrive afterwards, and certain will have been almost destroyed. What communities were destroyed? Well, the most obvious would be Newport, Rhode Island, which before the war had been one of the major Jewish communities, one of the major ports for the country. The port is destroyed during the war. The city, of course, is decimated. And obviously, this was one of the major Jewish centers. And so almost all the Jews left. Isaac Turo, who we all have heard of, I don't know if everybody realizes, was one of the major, if not the major Jewish Tory, ended up leaving the country, living in the Caribbean for the rest of his life after the war. So the Newport community is decimated. The Jews almost all leave. The synagogue closes down for like 100 years. It is given over control to the New York synagogue, the building of which was saved by this Hessian. What is the modern issue that came up because of this? Does anybody remember the stories we talked about the Rimonim? The Turo synagogue had these Rimonim, which are the crowns that are put on the Torah. So one crown is called a keter, and we have the two smaller ones that are called rimonim, which in Hebrew also means pomegranate or grenade, funny enough. So Turos synagogue had these two rimonim that had been made by a very famous, and Herbert and Teresa just joined us, probably know the more specifics, very famous metal worker in the 18th century, and they were worth millions of dollars. So the Turos synagogue sold them to a museum, I believe in Boston. Well, Sherith Israel in New York sued them to prevent them from selling the rimonim off, saying that those rimonim are ours because we were in control of your synagogue for over 100 years, even longer. So we were the caretakers of your synagogue for 100 years. Those rimonim are ours. We don't want to sell them. And so this court case went back and forth. Sherith Israel won the first time, Turos won the second time. By the time Turos won the second time, the museum obviously did not want to have anything to do with it. But you could see the revolution had a major effect that lasted even until only a few years ago when this issue was brought out. One of the other cities that suffered, of course, would be our own city, Savannah. Savannah was the other major Jewish city that suffered. Why did we suffer? Like Newport, we were taken over by the British and our city was decimated. Not quite as bad as Newport, as we were not as major of a port even then, but certainly our city was decimated. Unlike Newport, however, Jews returned to our city in the later years, and then more immigrants came. Newport would not have that luxury for a very long time. On the other side of the coin, what two cities emerged as the central Jewish cities for America and would be so for a very long time? Philadelphia, which was kind of like the Jewish freedom city where all the Jews went who were kicked out of their cities during the war. And the other would, of course, be Charleston. Charleston was already the largest Jewish city in America and would continue to be so all the way until the 1840s. So whereas Savannah and Newport suffered, Charleston and Philadelphia were Jewishly invigorated. It would become the center of the Jewish world. Many, if not most, of the revolutionary heroes and great Jews of the early 19th and late 18th century were living in Philadelphia and Charleston. We'll hear more about Mordechai Sheftel after he was released from prison. He ended up in Philadelphia for a while, as well as so many. So Philadelphia really and Charleston would become the major Jewish cities until New York would really rebound in the 1820s and really in the 1840s more. So it's I think ironic that most people think of the South as being a place where very small amounts of Jews, where Savannah at one time was the largest Jewish community in America, and then Charleston was the largest Jewish community in America for almost 100 years, and certainly by far the largest from the Revolution till New York became the Jewish center, but not so much later. So what we also see from this war is, and I'm not a business person, as I say before, so these are generalities, people with established businesses tended to suffer, and Jews who were in the mercantile industry suffered because obviously business was slowed down. On the other hand, where some businesses faltered and even went kaput, young Jews who were entrepreneurial and knew how to take advantage of a war and post-war America thrived. So we saw a lot of the money that had existed before the revolution in the Jewish world disappear, but after the revolution, a whole host of other Jews started to make their wealth. So the Jewish wealth actually did not take overall a downturn, but it just went from one place to another. And obviously the centers of these places were Charleston, but really I think even though Charleston would have the highest number of Jews, I think Philadelphia had the biggest amount of Jewish money. Examples of these people, Urias Hendricks, and then there were Hessian immigrants like Alexander Zunz, who I told you saved Sherith Israel, New York, actually stayed in America as did Jacob and Philip Mark and Joseph Darmstadt, and they ended up really taking advantage and really making their wealth. Although the war was a demoralizer, the post-war was invigorating in many ways. For one, there was the eventual freedoms given to Jews, which we all know the story of this. There was a lot of debate, though we don't always talk about in schools, as to whether there was going to be religious freedom. We assume it was going to be the case. That obviously was not the case. But before I continue, Teresa and Herbert, I want to make sure I invited the mom if you had anything you wanted to add about what I've said so far. Well, okay, thank you. So what were the debates? The debates were, I think most people post-war were not anti-Jewish and were there specifically to put down Jews, but some thought religion should be maintained as a part of our country. You had Protestants who were profoundly against this idea. They had faced persecution in Europe and they wanted it to be a separation of church and state, but you also had Catholics. You had states that really were supporting the idea that non-Christians should be part of society, but shouldn't be given full rights. And so this debate continued on as to what should be given. Should Jews, for instance, be given, obviously, I think most people on both sides said for business and commerce and worship, they should be allowed to do it and have a certain abilities and freedoms, but not to be citizens, and that states should limit the rights of religion. So we know this was the case. We also know that it was not the religious people who made the decision in the end. The reason Jews have full rights in America, and they got them in most states, were because of the enlightened rationalists. It was not the religious Protestants that made this decision. It was Franklin, Jefferson, Adams, and Paine, people like this. Jefferson wrote the 1785 Religious Freedom Act. In 1777, there was already precedent that New York became the first state to extend liberty of conscience to all native born. So it was really people like Adams and Franklin who created this equality in our country. However, it wasn't full equality as we would think, because there was full equality federally, but not every state gave full equality. We know Georgia was the state that certainly gave Jews full rights even before the revolution, but the states in New England, New Jersey, Maryland, and North Carolina all had Protestant laws on the books. So why was this an irony? The irony is Ron could have been president of the United States of America as a Jew, but he could not have been, the coroner for a small city in North Carolina, because those states I listed did not allow Jews to run for office, whereas states like New York and Georgia did. So after the war, we saw these congregations. There were 6 after the war because Richmond had created a congregation after the war.
Rabbi, can I ask you a question?
Please, please.
I understand why maybe Massachusetts or maybe even Pennsylvania that were founded based on religious, particular religions, would not allow Jews to participate in certain activities. I mean, or other groups, whoever the others were, probably. But what was going on in North Carolina that prevented that?
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I wasn't quite sure what groups were there.
You have to understand, and you probably know more about this than I do. The idea of rights for Jews was really strange. I mean, this had never really happened. I mean, Jews had full rights in Georgia like other Georgians, but Georgia was not a separate entity. We were part of the British Empire. So the idea of full rights for non-Christians, the idea of full rights itself was strange. But it was more the idea that we have been very good to the Jews. What more do they want? And so there was still this idea that you still had to be, it was more of an allegiance to Protestant than anti-Jewish in nature. Obviously, there are a lot of prohibitions against Catholics as well. Catholics were probably more persecuted at this point than Jews. So a lot of these laws that affected Jews really affected Catholics even more so. But it wasn't necessarily an anti-Jewish thing as a, we are Christians who are fighting for Christian rights. This is what we want. And the Jewish question was kind of like almost secondary. It wasn't even a thought. Why would we give them rights? There's no reason to it. They've got business. They have their synagogue. They're doing fine. I don't know if there was any particular persecution outside of maybe New Hampshire. New Hampshire was very, very anti-Jewish for some reason. Anybody knows why? I do not know. But most of these states were not anti-Jewish. They just, I'm sorry? Somebody may know. Do you know, Jeff?
Not on New Hampshire, but Maryland probably had the harshest and most strict laws, which is kind of interesting because Maryland was founded as a refuge for Catholics.
Catholics, right?
Yeah.
Right. And they passed a law called the Religious Tolerance Act, which guaranteed religious freedom for everybody as long as they were Christian.
And that's what.
And it had a kicker in it. If you practiced a non-Christian religion, it could be penalized by up to death, which incidentally, they had a trial of 2 Jews. And one of them was sentenced to death, but it was never carried out and more rational heads prevailed. But Maryland, surprisingly enough, was very intolerant in the beginning towards.
Jeff, was that a reaction to, was that part of the leftovers of the Inquisition era?
I'm not really sure, but as you know, Catholicism kind of chased the Jews to the New World too. Brazil, when Portugal
right.
took over, and of course, the story becomes House of Havana and, and the New World and everything else. But I'm sure it was left over from those type of prejudices.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because Maryland was definitely one of the, I didn't realize it was worse than the other ones. But again,
it got better after that. It then became one of the more tolerant states in the country.
But all of those states listed all had that same rule that you had to be professed Christian to participate. Now, this doesn't mean there was whole-scale persecution of Jews. As we all know, comparatively, they were just happy. Most of them, many of them may not have cared. They were just happy they could go about their everyday lives without worries. But by 1830, every state except for New Hampshire had changed the laws and had given, and Jews had the opportunity to hold office in every state except I think New Hampshire lasted until well after the Civil War, where Jews couldn't. So again, I think there was just suspicions.
You got another question, right?
Oh, sorry. Was that Michael?
Stuart.
I don't see. Where are you? Oh, there you are. Hey, sorry. How you doing, Stuart?
Hi, I got.
Sorry, you were not on my. Or as you don't know, his real name is literacy.
That's it. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
You weren't on my picture, so I could say how you doing, Stuart.
Yeah. Hi. We have to remember that there wasn't a general acceptance governmentally anywhere in Europe until the time of Napoleon. He was really the first one who gave any rights to the Jews, which were taken back away when the monarchy came back and then came back in. So a lot of what we're seeing now, if you look at what was happening in the New World, coincides to the timing of European history, particularly the Napoleonic Wars.
And that's a very good, uh, good thought, because this idea of free rights for Jews had never really been part of the world for a very long time. Obviously, what we did here affected Europe, but of course, Europe was a completely different entity, and they'd go through a whole different series of issues. But yeah, I mean, the fact that the federal government and so many of the states did give these rights to Jews, that's the story, not the ones that didn't, but that so many more, almost not, probably a little less than half, I think maybe 5 out of the 13, or 6 out of the 13 states gave full rights to Jews right away. I mean, that was pretty impressive. And what we saw from the Jews, they were very supportive of this new country. They were thrilled. And so the synagogues, started to celebrate American events, not just Jewish events, but American, when they celebrated the Constitution, the synagogues, of course, celebrated. We all know that all 6 synagogues sent congratulatory letters to Washington, even though ours was the first one, and we got the first one back, and make sure to write all of that down. So synagogues also had to change, because America changed to this idea of freedom for individuals, voting. What a concept. And so just like America changed, what happened in the synagogues is they had to do the same thing. Whereas they had been these coercive bodies where all Jews were almost forced to join these synagogues or be part of it, and they were usually led by the most powerful men in the community. After the war, they started to be more voluntary organizations, with people getting the right to vote. Any man over 21 who had been in the city for 3 months and was a member could vote now in the congregation, just like we could vote in America for elected officials. So they also had to be a little bit more focused, kind of like what's happened in the last 25, 30 years, on the congregants, because now that it was a more voluntary organization, that there were freedoms, that Jews had full rights, the congregations had to pay attention to all the individuals because they wanted them to stay in the congregation. So the synagogue life we see today in America and the world in many ways is based upon what happened during the Revolution. One of the great indicators is, one, people who intermarried started to be still welcomed, maybe in the community. And very interestingly enough, I was reading from Jonathan Sarna, a lot of the minute books in synagogues were now using Christian dates, as they call it. So instead of using Hebrew dates, they would use Christian dates or the Gregorian calendar for dating of their minutes, showing that they're part of the overall world. And I think that's, it's kind of similar to what we want today. We want to be part of the country. So the tensions in the Jewish world became predominantly between, we want to be American and we want to be Jewish. We want to be part of society, but we want to be separated in some ways. Sound familiar? The same tensions that we have today. It really started here.
Do you think part of that also, do you think part of that also was, for lack of a better way of saying it, a lack of education, Jewish education? People were more focused on probably making a living, surviving, fighting the American Revolution, integrating to some extent into society, into the larger society, which is part of the business and all that. But do you think that part of the changeover of for example, of the calendar, and of not using Jewish dates, but of using secular dates or Christian dates, whatever, was the fact that maybe, or not maybe, not wasn't a fact, the idea that maybe that generation, which would be like from in Georgia, 2 generations, at least 2 generations after they came to America, just had lost that knowledge.
I think so. I think some of that was the lack of Jewish education. I think a lot of it was very similar to what happened to America after World War II. You know, Jews came up after World War II saying to themselves, we just fought for America. I mean, we had 500,000 people fight. We spent our money buying bonds. Our wives back at home worked in the factories, or they served somehow in the military as well. After World War II, we felt more American, and people who fought alongside Jews felt more akin to them. And this is what happened in the revolution. They saw that Jews said, we fought in this revolution. We helped finance the revolution. We helped support the revolution in every way. The vast majority of Jews in this country were Tories. So there was this feeling of we are American, or at least not as much as today, obviously, there was still a separation, but much more so. And so there was this idea that we are part of something bigger than ourselves for the first time. Plus the idea that this free education, which we know is going to be taken advantage of. So I think it was a combination of all of these things that really gave Jews a sense of connection and confidence, which they probably hadn't had in a long time. Now, let's also, I don't want to skip over. We definitely want to take some time to talk about some of the people who made a name for themselves in the revolution. So I'll let Herbert, if you want to talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about maybe Mordechai Sheftel. If you don't want to, I got some I didn't, I can talk about, and you can add Mordechai Sheftel and Abigail Minus, the two most famous Sabanians.
Well, Mordechai Sheftel was the son of one of the original settlers. He was born here almost, I think, right after Benjamin and Pearl Sheftel came to America in 1733. I think he was born in 1734. So by the Revolution, I guess he would have been in his 40s. His father was somewhat successful. But he became very successful as a businessman in both mercantile business, shipping, and he also owned a lot of land, and he also also was in sales, owned stores. But he was very much a patriot. Hold on just a second. I've got a little information about him. Let me switch to. There we go. He was a merchant, a shipper. He owned a lot of real estate. He did own slaves. That I think he passed on to his children. He was but during the American Revolution, he was a soldier. He also was the chair before the Revolution of the Savannah Parochial Committee for American Independence, which was a organization that met. It was an organization of patriots and revolutionaries, and he was the chair of it, which tells you a little bit about how integrated by that time, 40 years after they landed, that they were integrated into Georgia Savannah society. He was the highest ranking Jewish officer in the American Revolution. He was a colonel. His official title was the Deputy Commissary General to the Continental Troops. in South Carolina and Georgia. And he was, like I said, became a colonel. And he also his oldest son, Sheftel, was kind of tagging along at his side. And they eventually got, I think it was probably during the Battle of Savannah, or in that time period, they were arrested. They were put on a ship, and I think they were taken to Antigua, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Mhm.
And eventually, they were allowed to leave the ship, as well, and basically they were paroled. And as long as they agreed not to fight against the British any longer. And that's when they moved to Philadelphia, which is what Rabbi Haas was talking about a few minutes ago. And Mordecai Sheftel became active at Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. He was, there's some documents that he wasn't the main leader of the Philadelphia congregation, but he was very active in it, and he was a leader in it for a brief amount of time before he came back to Savannah. One of the things I would mention to Rabbi Haas that I had learned something new about him, thanks to Rita Elliott, who is the head of one of the heads of the Lamar Institute, which is an archaeological group in South Carolina and Georgia, based in I believe in Georgia. He also gave money to the Patriot cause, or loaned money to the Patriot cause, to the tune at that time of $27,000, which is a nice chunk of change today, but it translates into, in today's money, it translates into close to over $500,000. And that was something I'd never heard any numbers. I'd always heard that he did give money. He was supposed to get the money back, but I think that never happened. When he got back here, he eventually became he was always active in at Mikveh, as active as anybody in Mikveh Israel. But at one point, he became president of Mikveh Israel before Parnas, before he died. Abigail Manus, very interesting story. Her husband died, and she was left with several children to raise. He was relatively successful, but she's the one that really made the money in the Manus family. And she was very wealthy by the time she died. She also gave money to the Patriot cause. Eventually, she moved to, and as did Mordecai Sheftel's wife, moved to Charleston during the Revolution. And she owned a tavern, and it was one of the hubs of Patriot activity before the Revolution and during the Revolution. And both of those families have descendants who live in Savannah today. I wanted to mention, going back to Mordecai Sheftel, I mentioned the fact that he was the head of one of the Patriot groups in Savannah. He kind of the assimilation or the integration of Jews in Savannah was really begun among others, by his father, who was one of the members of the Union Society, which was a group that supported what is now Bethesda Orphanage, or used to be Bethesda Orphanage, which is the oldest existing orphanage in the country today. And the Union Society was established by five guys: Mordecai Sheftel, who was Jewish. There was a Catholic man and a Protestant man, and we don't know who the other two people were, or what kind of background they had. But the fact, and the reason they called it the Union Society, and it's still called that to this day, is because it was a union of the religions to work for a common cause. That was, and also he was a founding father of the Solomon's Lodge, which is a Masonic group, and it started in 1734. It started as soon as it actually started, got a name quicker than Mikveh Israel got its name. So
And Lodge is still here. They still have a lot of
Solomon's
lot
Lodge,
of
Solomon's Lodge is still here. And back a few years ago, I wrote an article about the Masonics movement in Savannah, and it basically highlighted that group. Thank you.
Thank you. And for those who know, Herbert is the head of our archival committee, the History and Heritage Committee, which does an incredible amount of research. People calling us all the time, emailing us about finding out information. We just got asked about, for instance, a naval officer named Levy, trying to find out where he was buried. So they do an incredible amount of work. And what was interesting also at Abigail Minus is somehow she petitioned the British when she left the city that she got to keep all of her stuff when she came back after the war. So that's how formidable she was. She basically told them, when I come back, I want all my stuff back, and they acquiesced to her. Mordechai Shefter was not as lucky. So thank you, Herbert. Again, those are the two most famous people. Our congregation continued to be a congregation, but most of the Jews obviously had left because we lost the war. And there's some really interesting articles about there's some actual original sources that were just found that speak about the treatment that Mordechai Sheftel and Sheftel received when they were on the prison ship. And it's a really quite an incredible story. So there are a couple of them. Of course, the most famous revolutionary of all of them is Chaim Solomon. And obviously, I think how many of us heard of Chaim Solomon? He's almost become a legend or a myth in many cases, because he did exist. But of course, the legend has come about that what's the legend that he did? He financed the American Revolution. That's kind of the legend. Now, it's not entirely true. Obviously, there were several Jewish people who helped finance the revolution, including Minus and Mordechai Sheftel. But Chaim Solomon obviously is the most famous. And he's not from here. He's from Poland. So he came over here after he had distinguished himself with his gift of languages and finance. He moved to America just shortly before the revolution. It wasn't till the mid 1770s that he came here. And originally, he came in, and the British immediately, for some reason, thought he was a spy after he'd only been here a few years, because he had joined the Sons of Liberty. He was captured by the British very early on in the war, but because of his ability with languages, ironically, he became a translator for those Hessians we talked about, the German soldiers of fortune. He became the translator for them, for the British, so he was not in prison. And that was and so afterwards, he became one of the financiers after his term ended, he was released, and he helped to finance the war. He's really most famous because not of all the money he financed, because of one particular instance. When Washington was broke, and the Continental Army was trapped by Cornwallis in Yorktown. We all know the story. It is Washington who told the leaders elsewhere, when they could not get enough money, he said, "Go get Solomon. He'll do it." And that was Washington who specifically said, go get this man. I know he'll figure out a way to do it. Send for Chaim. I think it was officially send for Chaim Solomon. That was the exact wording he said. And so Solomon very quickly, and again, I'm not a business person, but raised the $20,000 that helped George Washington keep his army in uniforms and food through the winter. And of course, we know they escaped Yorktown and eventually would win. But in many cases, he is the one who helped save them. And so that's why he became so famous. He also established hospitals. He financed other battles, but he also gave his personal money to a lot of people. He personally financed people like James Madison and many of them who were not famous or well known, but were destitute because of the war, basically gave away all his money as well as financing the war. And so after the war, unlike Mordechai Sheftel, who was broke but was able to get some semblance of his money back, Chaim Solomon died in 1785. So he was basically completely broke by the end. Of course, after the war, he ended up being part of the Philadelphia congregation, as so many people did, or Charleston. So Philadelphia claims him as one of their own, but he was only there for like 3 years. So that's what he became famous for. Not only he later became famous as the Jewish financier, but was really the man who financed George Washington and saving him at Yorktown, and for financing other battles as well. And of course, he was a Freemason, and obviously his family didn't get any of the money back after the war. America did not pay back anybody. I don't think it was anti-Semitic in nature, because I don't think they paid back anybody, not just the Jews, but who knows? Some others may be more familiar with that. So who are some other characters that were famous from the war? Let's go over just a few of them. We don't have a lot of time, but Aaron Lopez, he was one of the Newport Jews, and he had to abandon the city, and they had to settle in Massachusetts with 70 people because of his service. Isaac Turo, of course, was one of the most famous Jews of the time, and he was actually a Tory. So he ended up leaving the country and living out the rest of his life in Jamaica. Reverend Gershon Mendes Sextus, who of course is probably the most famous clergyman, even though he wasn't really a rabbi, but he was the rabbi of the religious leader of the Shearith Israel in New York. And as the British were coming into the city, he convinced a lot of his supporters or his congregants to leave the city if they were Tories, and even some of the loyalists and the Whigs even left. And so he actually left the city as well, and so he was saved. David Franks was a famous loyalist. He was the agent of the actual king in the northern colonies, but other members of his family actually served with the Continental Army. So the Franks was probably the most famous, and maybe the Harts, where they had a major family member on one side of it and other family members on the other side. And so if you want to look up that would be David Franks. And as we know, there were Jews who fought in almost every battle. There were Jews at Bunker Hill. There were Jews at Valley Forge. There were people who helped financially, not just financing, but like Isaac Moses, who outfitted pirate ships to attack the British, and who helped to try and run the British naval blockade. Remember, the British were blockading many of the ports, and he helped sponsor boats that were running through these blockades. Anybody else have any ideas or thoughts on what happened during the Revolution? We get all of it. That's just a very basic. When it comes to the Mordechai Sheftel, it's very interesting for a couple reasons. Obviously, he was Jew. He was actually, I believe, he was a general, but I think he was given the title general, but they just hadn't quite voted on it yet when he was captured, maybe. But in the battle for Savannah, in the notes, it's the orders, it says, fall back to the Jewish cemetery. So the Jewish cemetery, which is right, am I right, Herbert? And you can quote me. There are two Jewish cemeteries. There's one started by Mordechai Sheftel, one by his half-brother Levi. Levi's cemetery was for any Jew in the community who happened to be here. Mordechai's was the family. So they actually retreated to
The other way around, Rabbi.
Was that I missed it? Okay, Mordechai's was for the community.
Mordecai's was for everybody.
And Levi's was for that.
Yeah.
Mordechai Sheftel is also labeled by the governor as that Jewish rabble-rouser who is leading the Savannah community astray. So he was considered by the British as the Tory, the head Tory in Savannah, even though there were others by some of the British, although we know that there were others who had that. He was captured because the irony of Mordechai Sheftel, he was a religious Jew. He kept kosher, he kept the Sabbath, but there was one law he did not follow, and that's why he was captured. The one law that is required by a Jewish adult male to make sure that his son does three things: that he finds a wife, that he has a business or he has some sort of way to make a living. Does anybody know the third thing a man is required to teach his son? Make a living, wife, and how to swim. That's actually the third thing that is required by a Jewish. He never taught his son Sheftel to swim. And so when everybody was escaping across the river, I think it was the Savannah River, Mordechai and his son got there, and his son did not know how to swim. He was 17. And so Mordechai stayed back with his son and was captured with his son. And that's why they were captured. Whereas if Sheftel, you have to understand, was kind of he was a very good lawyer, and he was a very dedicated Savannian, but he may have been a little bit on the scale, may have had Asperger's or something akin to that. So socially, he was kind of inept. And am I right about that, Herbert? I got the right story? I think so. And so I think I think it was his brother Ben who was getting married to a prominent woman in Charleston for a family who was not religious. And there's an old law that says if a husband dies before the family has children, the wife marries the brother. So, and if she doesn't want to marry the brother, she does the chalitza with the shoe. Well, his bride in Charleston said, we have to do the chalitza before we even get married, because I'm not marrying your brother if you die. And so it's the only time we have in history where the chalitza was done before the marriage. What was her name again? I forgot his Benjamin's wife's
Nellie.
name.
Her name was Nellie Bush.
Nellie Bush.
Alcala was her actual name, and I guess a nickname or Americanized name was Nellie.
But Benjamin at this time was young. Sheftel was the oldest son at 17. Ben was too young to serve at that time. But in the Savannah, many of the Jews left here and went to Charleston, as in so many other areas. Unlike Newport, which is decimated, the Jewish community did return here in the later years, and more Jews moved here during the German immigration. The Touro Synagogue, the Newport, Rhode Island community would not return until the Eastern European immigration of the late 19th century. That's where, and so here we got the German Jews, and plus some of the Sephardic Jews came back here as well. So any thoughts? Flossie wanted to add something, or Stuart?
Yes.
And then we'll go to Stuart.
where you bring in about the swimming, I don't see Jews in the past living that much near water.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah, that is true. In some places, though, when these laws were written, there was water. You also remember a lot of Jewish law was solidified not only in the Talmud, but after the Talmud was completed. And where were these people living? They were living in Babylon. The people who wrote the Talmud, and also the Gaons who made all these laws. Basically, when the Talmud was finished, this reign of Jewish leaders named the Gaons, G-A-O-N, created all these laws. They, like the prayer book we have today, they're the ones who said that. Men can only marry one wife. They stopped wearing a yarmulke. All these rules that kind of were floating in the wind, they said they're official, and they lived right next to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So that's probably why.
Do they observe that law? I've never heard this. I'm so taken.
It has
aback.
always been known as a law, but of course, in many places, you know, there was no need to teach if there was no place to swim. So obviously places that had rivers or were port cities were the places that were, but the idea is you have to be able to run away and save yourself and not die in such a, not feeble way, but in such a way in which you should not die. So who knows the origins? We have to look up, Flossie.
So when we crossed the Red Sea, if it wasn't split, we could have swam.
No, you're right. We could have swum across. Unfortunately, these laws come much later. But,
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And there have been a couple of Olympic swimmers who've won gold medals, by the way.
That's true.
And I think an Israeli one who moved here also. What was his name? The backstroke guy. Yeah, he was Jewish.
I'm thinking of Mark Spitz, right?
Oh, Mark Spitz also. I forgot about him. He would have been the most obvious guy to bring up. Sorry, that would have been the most obvious. I don't know what I'm thinking. I'm trying to think of these lesser known guys.
Are you trying to go into jokes and they're not?
No, I was just trying to think of these lesser known ones, and I forgot the second greatest swimmer of all time. Stuart, you wanted to add something, I think? And you're on mute, Stuart.
I have a
Come back to
question.
Stuart. We'll go to Michael and come back to Stuart as Stuart's on mute.
Yeah. I have a comment and a couple of questions. The first question is, do you think there was any connection between the leftover or the remaining Hessians who had remained in America after the Revolution, having been here? Do you think that had any connection with the choice of America for people who were escaping from Europe?
I would imagine
it
it definitely had to have some effect if you knew Germans would already come here successfully. You know, these Hessians came here at a different time. I mean, the German immigration starts in the 1820s and really gets home in the 1840s because of all the issues that Stuart mentioned earlier. France, and namely Napoleon, brings freedom to Europe, and then the countries after he is taken down wrestle with this freedom thing, and Germany is the one, is probably even a better case than France, because they take away the rights and then they give them back. And then there's also a tension between what we call the Reformed Jewish community and the Orthodox Jewish community in Germany. The Orthodox Jewish community in Germany, funny enough, supported the government's taking away rights from the Jews. They were supporting the idea that the government should be in charge and we shouldn't have these freedoms, because that gave them control. Because for the early period of the 19th century, these Reformed Jews were starting to create different things, and the Orthodox wanted to clamp down. So when the Germans started clamping down on freedoms in the 1820s, the Reformed Jews were clamped down on because the Orthodox Jews requested the government to do so. The government would probably have ignored it if that had not happened. So that's pretty ironic there. But yeah, I think you come to places where you know things, and there were Germans already in America, so they had to have known that there was opportunity here. Plus, German was being spoken here. I'm sorry, Stuart.
I was going to say, that was another thing that had occurred to me, that sociologically, the Jews who came to America had a big difference from the other Jews. They would not have been as closely tied in their communities, what ultimately became the Shtetl community, or was the Shtetl community, as other Jews. As all people who came to America, they were probably a little more adventurous, also a little more independent. And I think that might have something to do with the nature of the communities, the Jewish communities and Jewish synagogues that were here earlier. The only way to practice Judaism that they knew was essentially an Orthodox format, but without the community, the nature of the tight community that they had. So these Jews would have been much more likely to absorb into the American communities than others. And one more quick comment on Sheftel. I was curious that because he was Polish, when they came over, and I checked it out, and there were essentially pogroms going on in Poland at about the time that Sheftel came here. So he probably was escaping persecution in Poland.
I think, well, first of all, and when it comes to America, 100, I agree 100. I mean, people came to America not because it was the center of the world, because they didn't like what was going on in their lives. They were adventurous. If you were a wealthy Jew living in any of these places, you did not come to America until persecution came to you. And the people who came to America at this
Right.
time were the ones who were seeking adventure, or who thought that their finances were in trouble, or were the younger brothers who weren't in the business.
Mm-hmm.
And as for the last thing, I think Mordechai Sheftel was from Germany.
Oh,
His
then
family, but I mean, it's all connected. They moved to England first, so I would have to ask Herbert what I don't know exactly what. where they
I'm
were from.
sorry. I meant Chaim Solomon.
Oh, Chaim Salmon, yeah, Chaim Salmon was
I meant
Paul, yeah.
Chaim Solomon. And there was a group in Poland called the Haidamaks, who essentially were carrying out pogroms against the Jews all the way from about 1820 into the from about 1740 all the way up to the 1770s.
That would fit the time period exactly. Michael had something you want to say.
Yeah, I just had a question. I mean, when Herbert mentioned that Sheftel was a slave owner, and
Yeah.
I guess the question is, I mean, he wasn't the only Jewish slave owner, but what was the general reaction of Jewish, well, clergy? I mean, there weren't very many rabbis there. I know the Torah doesn't forbid slavery, but as our tradition has moved on, it's not it's not something we do or would do. Did that have any?
I'll go to
Is there
Herbert.
ever any thought to that?
Well, first of all, there weren't any rabbis in Georgia at all, or in South Carolina.
There was no
that-
rabbi in America till 1840s.
Yeah.
They call that the good old days.
So it was a different. Each individual or each leader of the community was interpreting whatever law or whatever, Torah or Talmud or any of it. I should have mentioned Abigail Manus owned slaves as well. That was not an unusual, terribly if they could afford to, it was not an unusual to do. If you had land, you needed to have people to work the land. Of course, they didn't own them until the 1750s because slavery was outlawed in Savannah until then. But they did bring people over, hired people from South Carolina who were slaves. So that didn't answer your question, I know. I don't know. The first rabbi that came to Savannah was Jacob Rosenfeld, and he was in the 1850s, so that would have been in the hotbed period of slavery controversy. And I've never seen anything that he said yay or nay about it. Maybe he had other, he was actually the first rabbi. He was during that same time they were building other institutions like schools and stuff like that, Jewish schools. stuff like other institutions that come with rabbinical support, and it just may not. He may not have wanted to cause the controversy. I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I think what we've seen is there's a couple reasons. One, we have, as human beings, have the incredible ability to excuse ourselves of just about anything if we want. I mean, I killed somebody, but you know what? He was not really a prominent member of society, or he was a bad person. So this, I think that's the ability. And I think Jews excused themselves because they really couldn't stop the slave trade at all, obviously. And if you wanted to compete in business, you probably had to have slaves in certain ones. So they excused themselves by probably saying stuff like, which is probably true, I treated them better than non-Jews. Or I only, if you were a slave, you could be sent somewhere else to work and you could get paid, whereas your master would get paid a sum, but you get paid some. Well, I used so-and-so slaves from Charleston, so I paid them. I mean, so there's always ways to excuse ourselves from our mistakes. Obviously, what's unfortunate is because we're Jews, there's all those rumors out there and that Jews ran the slave trade, that Jews owned all the slaves, that they were the preeminent slave owners, which is obviously impossible because most Jews did not live in, most Jews were small percentages of the people, and except for Charleston, there were not that many Jews in the South. So, but Jews did own slaves, and they owned them here in Savannah. So we can excuse them for saying they lived in an age where it was okay, but I think more so we should say they just were able to excuse themselves, as we do for a lot of things we do wrong.
Yeah, I wonder if they freed them in this, the seventh year or the Jubilee year. I wonder if they freed their slaves.
That's a good question. Well, what's difficult about that is the situation itself, which we saw after the Civil War. Freeing your slave was not always the best thing for that slave in the moment.
That's right.
It's like, I'm going to destroy a building, but I'm not putting a building. So if I free a slave and they can't get a job and their family is still my slaves, they're going to starve. You can't just destroy the system. You've got to rebuild it. So I imagine if you freed a slave, you had to find a place for them. I think there were laws enacted actually where you had to find places for them to go, because the South did not want free slaves just walking around. If you freed a slave, I think you had to get them going somewhere else. So if the Jews wanted to do that, they would have to find places for them to go. But who knows? We don't have a lot of records on slave keeping, and I know people have wanted to do those records, but there's just not. You'd have to find original sources. So Herbert would have to do that because they're the ones who do it. And I know people have asked time. I mean, that's one of the most often asked questions is, did Savannah Jews own slaves? And yes, it was not the majority, but they did. So it was a terrible thing, and we can't excuse them for what they did. We also know that they fought in the Civil War. They fought not necessarily because of supporting slavery. They fought because they were in the South, but they did fight to keep that institution alive. So we end on a low note, but we'll end on a high note. I'm sorry, Herbert.
I was just going to say, this is indirectly related to some of the people Savannah people we were talking about anyway. I read an article that was put out by the Georgia Historical Society a couple of years ago in their journal. It was about a guy named, I think his first name was John, but his last name was Penrose. And there's over on Whitmarsh Island, there's a Penrose Avenue or road that's named for him. And what it basically was talking about was for a person who came to Savannah right at the beginning. I don't know. I don't think he was an original settler. Maybe he was an original settler, but if not, he came in the 1730s. And what it was talking about was basically the amount of flexibility for a person to become successful back then in that situation, the amount of flexibility that was needed. You start out as a farmer and you find you're not a good farmer, and so you attach to it a well, I'm going to sell my crops. So you start a store, then you find the store isn't going to work. So then you do something. And John Penrose did that. I think maybe it started out as like a carpenter, and ended up owning a ship over a period of 30 years or 40 years. And I think Mordecai Sheftel and Abigail Minus and some of the other Jewish people who came to Savannah also had to have that same sort of flexibility. You started out as a farmer, and then you became a merchant, and then you became a trader of maybe of furs, as the Nunez people did, or perhaps as shipping, go into shipping and that sort of thing. And that was the only way to basically survive. And I just wanted to emphasize that those people, Benjamin Sheftel, Mordecai Sheftel, Abigail Minus, and the Nunez people and others, they just had to have an amazing amount of flexibility and creativity in order to survive. It wasn't just business smarts or religious smarts or any of that sort of thing. It was just their personality had to be such that they said, okay, well, this isn't working, so I'm going to do something else, or I'm going to leap off of that and do something else. And I just thought an article about John Penrose was so interesting, and I'd never thought about it, but he was just like a person in microcosm of a relatively successful person who survived during those early years. I just want to share that. That's maybe a little higher point.
I think it's a great, I mean, today there's so many
Than
opportunities.
slave.
There's so many opportunities. You can, if you don't want to be in this profession, go that, but again, they were so limited comparatively. So they had to do what they had to do. So thank you, Herbert. I appreciate you coming. Hopefully you'll come again. Really adds a lot. Thank you, everyone. We haven't decided, did we decide what we're talking about next week? Next week, we are going to be talking about, does anybody remember? I don't think we decided. We talked about, I don't think we had talked about, nothing, we did not talk about. Anybody have any ideas? I can just figure out something and send it out.
It might be too much for you to look into for 1 week, but I'd really be interested in hearing about the early Jewish judicial, or the history of the Jewish judicial system, perhaps from Sanhedrin to.
Oh, that's great. I'll be happy. That's a good one. So we'll do that. We'll talk about the Sanhedrin and the other courts and how they worked, and which ones were actually in existence and which were more myth. Well, you can talk about the one in Babylon as well. By the way, does anybody here want to do a video for a Torah reading or a Haftorah reading for this Saturday? I'll send it to you. Just video it and send it in a link. All right, nobody. All right, just thought I'd ask.
I'll do
Maybe
it.
next one.
Who said I'll do it? All right, we had somebody.
Terry.
Terry, all right, do you know how to video yourself and then create a link or send it off? I can teach
I
you. All right, great.
Let me call you afterwards. I just got a call from my niece about my brother.
Okay, so everyone, thank you very much.
Thank
Always
you.
a pleasure. Next week, we're going to talk about the famous Jewish court system that we hear so much about. And we'll talk about the actual courts and also the ones that were a little bit more
Second, what?
civil. And talk to you guys later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Rabbi, thank you.
Take care, everybody. Stay well.
Thank
Everyone.
you. Thank you, Herbert.
I'll put everybody on group view. All right, there you go. Bye, guys.